So let's talk through this. So essentially our first period that we're going to talk about in this class that we need to go over is period 3. Now, the reason we're starting with period 3 is that the guidance from College Board is that the AP test is only going to cover periods 3 through 7, which is actually a huge advantage for us. It means that we do not have to worry about periods 1, 2, 8, or 9 showing up on that one and only question that you guys are going to receive on May 15th. That allows us to focus our attention on these periods and really kind of focus our studying. And so that's how we're going to approach this over the next few weeks. That doesn't mean that there isn't some advantage to knowing period 1 and 2. It provides some context for what we're going to talk about today. But ultimately, this is where we want to begin. Okay, so I'm going to essentially mute everyone right now so that we can, I can just talk, and then I'm going to unmute you guys at the end so that we can, you can ask questions. Okay, so let me just walk you through period 3. If you look at period 3, if you look at this slide that I have projected in front of you, period 3 is framed between 1754 and 1800. And the dates that kind of set the parameters for period 3 is the French and Indian War at the beginning of this time period, which is going to get us into the American Revolution, and then the election of 1800, which is when they sometimes call it the Revolution of 1800. It's when Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party took over for the Federalist Party under John Adams. Now, if we were to summarize this entire period, the most important thing to take away from it is that we're really talking about the era of the American Revolution. But what we want to do is we want to break it down a little further than that. And so what I've done along with the other AP teachers is we've tried to simplify every period into 3 essential stories that you need to know. And if you can just remember and really know these 3 stories inside and out, they pretty much create the basis for most questions that you're going to get on the day of the AP exam. So our first story that we're going to talk about is this one right here, the road to the revolution. And so when I talk about the road to the revolution, what I'm talking about is I'm essentially talking about the buildup to the American Revolution. What were the causes of the American Revolution? How did those causes evolve over time? And then how was the revolution itself fought, and what were its immediate aftermath? So story 1 is all about understanding the American Revolution and its significance in history. So let's kind of work through this story together. The American Revolution really begins with the French and Indian War. And some background that you should know prior to the French and Indian War are the following. The 13 colonies had been formed by this time period. They were established in period 2, starting in 1607. All the 13 colonies were slightly different based off of geography, but they were all loyal subjects to the British government. And on top of that, they were all, for the most part, part of a system that we refer to as mercantilism. For those that don't remember mercantilism, that was this economic system that said that the colonies existed to provide raw materials for the British government. And so they didn't manufacture anything. They manufactured they just produced raw materials. They would send it to Great Britain, and then Great Britain would sell those manufactured goods to back to the colonists. Now, even though there were rules in place for the way the colonies were supposed to conduct themselves, those rules weren't really well enforced. And so in the build-up to the French and Indian War, America was experiencing something called salutary neglect. And what that means is that the Navigation Acts, and there were some rules that were in place for the American colonists, but they weren't being followed. So the colonists had an enormous amount of freedom prior to the French and Indian War. That all changes. So the French and Indian War is an incredibly important turning point because it refocuses the attention of the British government back on the colonies. So for those that don't remember the French and Indian War, it was where the colonies in Great Britain fought against France, their colonies, and their Native American allies. And the war was essentially for control over North America. It lasted a number of years, and when it was all said and done, the British side won. So Great Britain takes control of pretty much all of North America, and that on the surface seems like a good thing. The colonists are initially happy about it. But the problem is that they created all these debts. It was very expensive to fight this war, and it made the colonists all of a sudden come under greater regulation by the British government. So in the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War, salutary neglect ends, and the British start placing taxes on the colonists so they can get back money that they lost during the war. In addition to that, they also want to make sure that the colonists are secure. So they start stationing more soldiers in the colonies. And we see that with the Quartering Act. And on top of that, they also start limiting where the colonists can go so that the colonists aren't having conflicts with Native Americans. And we see that with the Proclamation of 1763. And so ultimately what's happening in the 1760s into the 1770s is there's this growing tension between America and Great Britain over like growing taxes, the presence of like the British military, the colonists feeling like their right to self-government is being violated. And even though they don't want independence immediately, they gradually start to shift towards a desire for independence. Now, you should know how that happens. There's a number of Quizlet terms and like things that we've talked about that you could use and maybe bring into your cheat sheet that would be valuable here. You can talk about the Stamp Act in 1765. First direct tax. You talk about Samuel Adams and the establishment of the Sons of Liberty. You could talk a little bit about the Townsend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress. All of those events are getting us closer and closer to America's kind of decision to declare themselves independent from Great Britain. Now, the decision to declare themselves independent doesn't happen till 1776. And what it changes is that in 1776, a guy by the name of Thomas Paine writes this pamphlet called Common Sense that convinces Americans that independence is the best method to moving forward, and really kind of shifts America away from reconciliation towards becoming their own country. That same year, we see the Declaration of Independence written. We see these, and we also see the America becoming more heavily invested in fighting. Now, fighting had broken out before that, but all of a sudden now we've got a full-scale, officially declared rebellion between American colonies and the British government. Now, you should know that a little bit about the war itself, how Americans were divided between patriots and loyalists and moderates, that it wasn't like universally accepted by all people, but you also know that ultimately, and I hope we all know this, America wins. And we win largely from the help of outside countries, like specifically France, who gives their support to America following the Battle of Saratoga. The entire American Revolution is over by 1783, and in 1783 we see the Treaty of Paris signed, which makes America its own independent country. So this is the first story. Now, which of those terms you choose to pick to illustrate that story is completely up to you, but this is kind of the nature of what you need to know, and that makes up a big part of period 3. The second story that I want you to know is about the debates over federalism. And when I say debates over federalism, you probably want to maybe make a note of this. What I'm really talking about is the process of building a new country. So in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, the United States has to figure out, what is our government, what is our country going to look like once we have our independence? And so this story is all about that process of figuring it out. So we don't begin with the government that we have today. During the war, the first government that's established, the first constitution of the United States, is actually the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation is a terrible system that gives the federal government almost no power. It's incredibly weak. And under the Articles, there's no president, there's no federal court system, they can't tax, they don't have a standing army, they can't regulate trade, they can't stop disputes between the different states. It can do almost nothing. The only thing that the Articles of Confederation accomplish is that they help negotiate an end to the American Revolution in the form of the Treaty of Paris, and they create the Northwest Ordinance, which essentially organizes Western states for Western territory for future statehood. But we can see more problems than solutions under the Articles of Confederation. A good example of that is the Shays Rebellion, which takes place in 1787, where there's an uprising of farmers in Massachusetts because they feel like they're being unfairly taxed. And the federal government doesn't even have the power to put that rebellion down. So this leads to the Constitutional Convention and the calls for a new system that does become the current system that we have today, the Constitution. And at the Constitution, there's a series of compromises like the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Great Compromise, the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise, and so on, that helps to create the document that we have today. It's not all good, but it creates a unified system for the country. Now, once that Constitution is written, the framers put it to the country for a vote. And this leads to one of the biggest debates in American history over whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And there is this debate that basically merges between two major factions or groups. On the one hand, you've got the anti-federalists. And the anti-federalists are people who they think that the new Constitution is going to be too powerful, and they're worried about it, and they would not want to see it ratified. And on the other hand, you've got the Federalists who would like to see this Constitution take effect, and they think it's a much better system. This debate is pretty much ongoing, starting in 1787. And between 1787 and 1789, that's all our country's really talking about. One of the major events during this time period is the release of the Federalist Papers, which was written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, trying to convince the public that the Constitution is the best system. Ultimately, the Constitution is ratified, it becomes our new government, and then we elect our first president, which is George Washington. Now, even though we have the Constitution as our new system, it is important to note that there are still arguments about what even this new Constitution will look like. So what ends up happening is there's debates over, okay, what will be the responsibilities of the new federal government and what are going to be the powers of the states? And we see this in a number of different things. So we see like a lot of debates over, for example, our financial system. Hamilton's financial plan becomes really controversial because there's a number of people who believe that the government shouldn't have the power to create a national bank, whereas Hamilton sees it as necessary in order to create a better economy. He wants to create a national bank. He wants to assume the state's debts. And so there's controversy over that because we're arguing about how this new government should look like, how powerful should it be. Ultimately, this debate over the power of government leads to the creation of the first political parties. On one hand, you got the Federalists, which are led by Alexander Hamilton, and they argue for what we call a loose interpretation of the Constitution. They want stronger central government. They are pro-business, and they also want more power given to the central government. They're also pro-English. They tend to favor neutrality or the English government in terms of foreign affairs. On the other hand, you got the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. They tend to be for a stricter interpretation. They want a weaker government that favors the power of states. They tend to be pro-agriculture, and they also tend to be pro-French. And so, like, we've got these first political parties emerging over the debate over what our new government will look like. Throughout this time period, there's examples of how these two political parties are facing off against each other on this issue. A good example of this is the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 under John Adams, which was incredibly controversial. And of course, the Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson respond to that by issuing the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, saying that states have more power than the federal government and they should be able to nullify laws that they don't agree with. So like there's a lot of terms that you should look into, Quizlet terms and otherwise, that you can choose from to help tell this story. But make sure you're understanding the entire story from the Articles of Confederation all the way through the election of 1800. Now, the last story that we need to know is about our foreign policy. What is America's place in the world after we become our own independent country? So after the United States wins its independence, there's a question of, who will be our allies, how will we interact with other countries, what's going to be our views on foreign policy. And like these ideas are challenged almost immediately after the Constitution is created. So almost immediately after the Constitution, we see the French Revolution breaking out in 1789. Now the French had helped America during the American Revolution. And so there were some people in the United States who felt we were obligated to help them back. Thomas Jefferson, for example, and a lot of the Democratic Republicans wanted us to get more involved. Our president, however, and also the Federalists were concerned that America wasn't powerful enough to do that. And so America's first official foreign policy becomes one of neutrality. And we see that idea of neutrality and America staying out of foreign affairs, avoiding foreign alliances, play out in a number of different events during this time period. The Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, Jay's Treaty, which was about creating a better relationship with England so that we could stay out of war. And then lastly, Washington's farewell address, which warned us from getting involved in foreign alliances. The other important thing about foreign policy that you have to remember is our relationship with Native Americans. At this time period, the United States saw Native Americans as a foreign entity. They weren't considered part of the United States. And so America interacted largely with Native Americans to either create treaties or, in some cases, fight with them for control over westward lands. We see this with the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, which happens in 1795. The last thing we see with foreign policy is just America trying to establish its boundaries, figure out, okay, what exactly are our borders? This is will we have access to the Mississippi River, for example? We see that with Pinckney's Treaty, where we get the right of deposit, and we get rights from Spain at the time to ship our goods down the Mississippi River and drop them off in New Orleans. So this is the three stories that we need to really work on, and we really need to understand in order to understand period 3. So I'm going to stop this right